So welcome everybody to tonight's Artist Talk of Summerland, a sound installation by Matthew Ostrowsky. This, of course, is a very different type of artist talk that we've probably ever done before, since it is a virtual artist talk, and we would, under normal circumstances, be able to welcome you all into the galleries at the Albany Institute to see the installation in person. Just the way things are right now, this is sort of the situation that we are in for all of our programs, hosting them virtually. Just to cover some of our other virtual programs that are coming up, if you are interested in contemporary art, the Albany Institute is currently hosting the 2020 exhibition of artists of the Mohawk-Hudson region, which is on the same floor as this installation. So if you are able to come to the Albany Institute, you can see plenty of contemporary, and hear plenty of contemporary art in the museum galleries. And we will also be releasing, beginning tomorrow, short artist talks by the artists that are in the Mohawk-Hudson region as well. And 5 new videos will be uploaded to our website and YouTube page of featured regional artists for about the next 6 weeks. So please keep an eye on our website and our YouTube page if you are interested in contemporary art, because there will be a lot of content coming out. Next Sunday, not this coming Sunday, but the next Sunday, October 18th, we will be hosting a program confronting slavery, a family history in the Hudson Valley with Deborah Bruno and Eleanor Meyer, who are two people who have traced their roots back to the same slave-owning family in Coxsackie, New York, and they will be providing some insights into their genealogical research and the types of information that they have found. But tonight's Artist Talk by Matthew Ostrowsky is on his exhibition, Summerland. Now, we know that many of you here may not have had the opportunity yet to see and hear the exhibition. So we will be playing a short 4-minute video, which will give you a sense of what the installation looks like in the galleries. Today, joining me is Victoria Waldron. She is under the name Albany Institute of History and Art Education. If you should have any technical issues, if your sound isn't working, if your screen isn't working, please feel free to send Victoria a message in the chat box. We will also be utilizing the chat box for a Q&A session at the end of today's program. So after Matthew is done with his presentation, we will welcome audience questions, and we will ask that you please type those into the chat box, and I will then moderate and read them to Matthew for his answers. Thank you all for joining us. We will start with the video, and then after the video ends, I will introduce Matthew to begin his presentation. right, so that short video gave us a little bit of context and of the exhibition. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Matthew Ostrowsky. Matthew is a New York City native who has worked as a composer, performer, and installation artist, exploring work with music, multimedia, video, and theater, using digital tools and formalist techniques to engage with uh, quotidian materials. That's even a big word for me. Sonic, physical, and cultural. Ostrowski's work explores the liminal space between the virtual and phenomenological worlds. His work, which has been seen on 6 continents, ranges from live electronic performance to installations incorporating video, multi-channel sound, and computer-controlled objects. He is a freelance developer of interactive technology for artists and teaches at NYU and Columbia University. So please join me in welcoming Matthew.
Of coming is what's happening at the moment, but thanks for plugging in, I guess would be the best way to put it. I'd like to start off by thanking the Albany Institute for having me. I'm thrilled to be there. I'd like to thank Doug McCombs and Tamis Groff for having me in, Tom Nelson for really making the piece look super beautiful, and of course Patrick for making tonight happen. So thanks to all of you. And I would also say, if you can, try to actually make it over there to the Albany Institute, because this piece is definitely a 3D immersive experience. The video has only shown the tip of the iceberg as far as what it's actually like to be in the middle of it. So I hope you can all make it by. So let me start. Patrick kind of covered my biographical basics. And the thing I want to sort of emphasize in terms of my talking about how I got to this piece is that my background and training is as a composer and an electronic musician, not really a fine artist. So I kind of came around to this project, a different set of concerns than one might normally come across in with someone whose primary training is in the visual arts, because I'm always working from the starting point of sound. And most of my work uses material that's derived from some other kind of source. So if I'm working with sounds, I'll be using musical instrument samples or sounds gathered from the real world. Most of my video work actually incorporates Hollywood movies. And interest in the first place is digital film is a place where you can take these things that are out in the world and kind of transform them and manipulate them and make them in a sort of between the real world and your imagination. So of sort of quasi-mimetic art with electronics that's not purely in an abstract realm, but that is in contact with and engaging with and sort of trying to find a spot between the real world and the imagination of the audience. And so over the years, again, most of what I have done is taken some kind of material, manipulated it inside the computer, and then played it out through loud situation. But a few years ago, I got to thinking, well, rather than taking something from the real world, or let's be more accurate, a digital representation of something from the real world, and then transforming it into this kind of thing that I want to transform it to inside a computer, would it be possible to take an actual solid object, a thing that people are seeing right in front of them, and push it into that same kind of realm simply by changing the way it behaves? So rather than having my instrument, the final output, be a loudspeaker, which is of course a blank surface in a way, I became interested in the idea of taking objects and using them as speakers. And in that sense, I mean speakers in both senses of the word. A speaker as in loudspeaker, as in sound source, but also speaker in the sense of a character, of something that has some kind of agency and that is in itself capable of sort of signifying in some way or another. And I think of it as kind of like the difference between movies and theater. So if I'm dealing with pre-recorded sound or manipulated sound that's coming through a loudspeaker, that's kind of like a movie, because the magic has all happened sort of behind the screen in some other form of time. But in theater, you're watching Ian McKellen and King Lear at the same time. And the idea of this sort of flipping between a person being a person and a person being a character is also kind of part of the idea I had about these kinds of works, where an object is being an object, but it is also being something other than itself. So this is how I kind of got into this idea of working with these robotically controlled objects. And so once you've got that sort of idea of you're trying to take something and sort of have it become something else by changing its behavior, you kind of have to think really hard about what is the nature of the object. Because, you know, since you can do pretty much anything with a computer, it's pretty easy to sort of make something do something with, you know, some boards and some little robotic whatevers. And, you know, it can very easily sort of fall into the realm of parlor trick or science fair project more than an actual sort of coherent artwork. So what I'm trying to think about in my pieces is, I think about the materials that I'm dealing with as having two sorts of characters. So you've got a physical thing that's sitting in front of an audience. It's got a particular size, it's got a particular weight, it's got particular sonic possibilities sort of built into the object itself. And then it's just a thing that I can do something with. But of course, it also exists on this other level, which is as a cultural object. Because pretty much anything has some kind of connotative baggage. It's got social meaning, it's got personal meaning, it's got historical context. And so you've got sort of both of these levels going on, of a thing as a purely phenomenological physical object, and as something that has the potential to evoke, in sort of the general sense, various kinds of responses on various kinds of levels. And so what a lot of my work is about in various ways, but this piece certainly is to try to figure out a way to use sort of, you know, pretty formalist musical and compositional techniques to create some kind of environment in which those two aspects of an object can engage in a kind of active conversation between themselves. So I'm remaining true to the actual physical nature of the object, while at the same time having that physical part of it comment, express something about, undermine the sort of cultural, psychological matrix of the object. So the energy and the interaction is actually happening sort of inside the piece itself, between the physicality and the behaviors. And because I am a composer, ultimately it's got to sound good, because that is, if it sounds good, then people will sit, they will listen to it, and it is only by actually spending time with it that these other sorts of aspects of it have time to emerge. So the sort of seductive aspect of music is also an important part of this in terms of the entire experience that an audience will have. So this is sort of the basic set of ideas that I'm working with. And now I'll talk a little bit more specifically about this piece. And let's start off with, of course, the basic item that I'm using, which is, of course, the telegraph sounder, which is until people started doing telegraphs electronically, which wasn't really until about World War II, that object was how telegraph messages were transmitted during the mid-19th century, I mean, almost 100 years. This was how telegraphy was done. And this object kind of interested me for several reasons. Firstly, of course, it's something that's designed to create sound. So I'm actually, again, sort of respecting the original nature of the object by having it make sound. I'm not taking a pot and having some robot bang it or something like that, but I'm kind of using it in some way that matches its original intentions. The other sort of interesting thing about it from a purely physical point of view is, of course, it doesn't do much. It goes click. And that was also, for me as a composer, a really interesting kind of challenge, which is, how do I take the sort of the smallest possible amount of sonic material, right? Like some person in a cave, like banging two rocks together, click, that's all you get, and actually make something from the sort of smallest possible unit that's actually musically and sonically interesting. So it already was kind of an interesting thing just in terms of its that sort of object part. And culturally, it's also a kind of interesting object because it's the progenitor of every loudspeaker, every telephone. All audio technology is basically starts with the Morse code sounder. I mean, you can almost think of it as a speaker, but it's a speaker that just does one thing. It goes in and out instead of the way a normal audio speaker, it follows those nice waves. It's kind of a 1-bit speaker, ding, ding. And it's also, of course, Morse code is also the origin of all the binary code that now runs all the computers that we are currently using to communicate with each other at this moment. So it also has this kind of interesting place in the whole sort of history of technology and communication technology and sound technology. So then it's also got this aspect of, what does it do? It actually transmits language. So now I'm already starting to get kind of nudged in a certain direction about, like, okay, the nature of this thing is to transmit language. So maybe what I want to think about in terms of what I do with this is going to be linguistic. So I've got all that kind of basic stuff, which is fairly straightforward. But the thing that's sort of missing when you're dealing with something that's this old is most of us living now have no sense of what its cultural embeddedness was and what its networks of signification are, because these things used by the 40s. So it doesn't, all we know about it, just sort of from looking at it, is it's obsolete and no one uses it anymore. And that's kind of it. So in order to figure out how I could kind of fit its sort of social content into the piece, I found myself having to do a bunch of research as to what the telegraph meant culturally when it arrived in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. So doing a bunch of reading into its into this stuff, I sort of teased out sort of two main threads of thought about it. The first one, which is fairly straightforward, is the idea of the telegraph as a kind of positivistic tool, essentially for the extension of business and military interests. You know, instantaneous communication was obviously seen by a lot of people as a way of increasing the efficiency of trade, facilitating military intelligence, facilitating troop movements, you know, being able to make your wheat deal between Chicago and New York more quickly, and sort of generally enabling those who control the technology to sort of extend their control and make their control more efficient and sort of more homogeneous through this electrical network. So this is, you know, this is all fairly okay, right? This is what a lot of technology essentially is for, gets invented for, right? But the other thing that came up, you know, much to my surprise, I discovered that the other thing that happened was the taming of this force called electricity, which you have to remember, we're talking 1850s here. Electricity is not something that exists in people's worlds. You know, maybe, you know, something about like Ben Franklin and a kite or something like that, but you don't, it's not part of your life. So it is this kind of dimly understood force that's already a little bit magical. And suddenly here are these things that do this thing that was completely impossible, which is, you know, communicate instantaneously. What it happened was it started leading to a lot of speculation about the possibility of there being other invisible forces, which we perhaps could also tame. And what might be possible would be those other invisible forces would allow other kinds of communication with, say, alternate planes of existence. And so what happened was this sort of energy-based telecommunications model started becoming co-opted, is not quite the right word, but its influence kind of penetrated into the sort of spiritualist and religious tendencies, upstate New York, it's where it started, burned over district, that were already sort of potentially existing. And this was sort of got kicked off when the first reports of spirit communication, which were about 4 years after the first after the first telegraph lines were laid in the United States. And oh, how are these spirits communicating with us? Oh, they're tapping. There's already of like model there for like what's the minimum way of communicating. And this all started in upstate New York when two adolescent sisters, Kate and Maggie Fox, started, well, the whole family, the whole Fox family, started hearing these sort of mysterious tapping and rapping sounds in their house. And the Fox sisters somehow determined that these tappings were messages being transmitted by the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered, buried in the basement of the house by a previous owner. Now, okay, at first there's this little family thing with like, oh, there's all these crazy noises happening. And then, of course, word starts spreading and the local worthies get invited over and the local worthies start hearing these tapping sounds, which Kate and Maggie are basically claiming they can interpret. And then within 2-3 years, another sister, whose name unfortunately escapes me at the moment, who is somewhat older, decides to take the show on the road. And within 3 or 4 years, there doing the theater circuit, table tapping, various other kinds of exhibitions of spiritual. This catches fire. It's very hard for us to imagine how popular this was at the time. I mean, we sort of consider this a slightly marginal way of thinking, to put it politely, but this was something that was a subject of research by a lot of serious people, many of whom, by the way, were also involved in early telegraphy, but also lay people all over the country are having seances in their homes. Mediums are popping up everywhere. There are dozens of spiritualist publications in the United States. The largest one of which, oh, by the way, is called the Spiritual Telegraph. So this is a massively important phenomenon. And suddenly, everyone's trying to communicate with the dead. And the interesting thing that's happened is communication with the dead, before this, that was necromancy. This is someone like going out to a crossroads in the middle of the night with some eye of newt or something like that. And maybe you try to raise a spirit in order to find out, who stole your cow or something like that. But you didn't converse with the dead. The dead were scary, the dead were dangerous, but they knew things that you might want to know. Where's the treasure buried? So you would take these very intense spiritual risks to try to get some information out of them, send them back to Hades where they came from, and get away. But what happens at this time is that people start chatting with grandma. So the entire mode of communication starts changing. And this is partly a function of course, the idea of the fact that the telegraph is something that is simply a means of, basic communication, you're coming on Thursday, whatever. And also because the rhetoric and the language that the modern spiritualist movement was using was no longer particularly religious. So if you read any of these texts, they aren't talking about angels, they aren't talking about God, they don't even talk about heaven. In fact, the preferred term of art, invented by a spiritualist named Andrew Jackson Davis in 1867, was the Summerland. And so what's happening is they're using technological talk. They're talking about energy, they're talking about magnetism, they're talking, this is the kind of rhetoric that they're using in order to define their mode of communication with the dead. And so this technological model has made the dead non-threatening, for one thing. And if you read any of these seance transcripts, the dead, it seems like Central Park on a perfect autumn day is what it feels like. It's all very pleasant, it's all very nice. And there's a kind of, it's all very sort of pleasant and middle class over there in heaven. So it's this technological rhetoric that has kind of turned it into this other thing and become sort of normalized. So you have these two basic ideas. You have the sort of model of this sort of controlled, shared world that's coming via the ever-expanding telegraph network directed from the metropoles of, London and Washington and Paris. And then you have this other model of this extended energy, which is much, of course, sort of foggier and much more internal and much more personalized and much more about individual experience. Although, as an interesting sideline, the spiritualists were, by and large, well, two interesting points. historicals, and also extremely politically progressive at the time. Anti-slavery, they're for the women's vote, pro-temperance. So it also came with this very sort of politically progressive package. And there's actually a famous quote from, well, it's not that famous a quote, I'll make it famous. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who said that the only religious organization that treated women fairly in the United States were the modern spiritualists. So they've also got this other kind of thing going on. Anyway, so you do all this research, you know all this stuff. Well, so what? How do you actually make that into some kind of something resembling an artwork? So taking these two sort of basic ideas, I decided what I would do is I would pick two individuals as kind of avatars for these two different modes of thinking and use this choir of sounders to sort of make them speak to us from the. One of those is Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, of course, to represent the sort of earthly, businesslike end of it, and Kate Fox, the older of the two Fox sisters, and sort of use their words as my basic source to drive my little choir of telegraph sounders. Fortunately, we have copious written records from both of them. Morse's letters, his journals, several books, most of which, by the way, are anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic screeds of sorts. And there are hundreds of pages of transcriptions of Fox's seances and automatic writing. And you can kind of see in the video, there are some wall cards there which have excerpts of the text that are being used in the piece. So all the sounds that are being created in this piece are in some way or another derived from those two sets of texts. And what I decided to do was I was going to give each one of these avatars a voice that in my mind somehow mapped onto these ideas that I've been discussing. So for Morse, the text excerpts of his that I'm playing are all being played back in Morse code. And this sort of, universal cipher, which was the sort of, well, again, sort of the binary language of its time, everybody used it, it was the baseline. At the time, it was kind of the embodiment of this idea of this sort of standardized future unified by this electrical network, right? It was the language. It was almost the operating system that made it go. And however, well, now it's 2020. And although it was once, of course, understood by thousands of people, used every day, this language, Morse code, has passed into the realm pretty much of the esoteric. And, it's basically, the messages are totally clear, the code is true, it's all perfectly legitimate, but there's no one left to understand it. So this is what's happening with the texts I'm using from Morse. Now, the words of Kate Fox, or I guess more accurately, the words of various dead people that Kate Fox is channeling, or the word that they used at the time was echoing, they're being treated very differently. I'm sort of spinning off of some ideas initially developed by a German engineer, J.P. Rice, who was the inventor of the first telephone, which wasn't a very good telephone, which is why you have not heard of him. You've only heard of Alexander Graham Bell. He attempted to use very rapid clicking sounds to reproduce the human voice. And it didn't really work very well. But I got kind of inspired by this. And I was like, well, clicks I got a lot of clicks. So what I did was I wrote some computer programs that attempted to use my choir of sounders as a kind of voice synthesizer, directly reproducing recorded excerpts of the Kate Fox texts. Now, obviously, attempting to synthesize a voice using 19th century technology is kind of an absurd undertaking. But it's sort of exactly that absurdity that is kind of revealing something about the possibilities and the limitations of spiritualist communication. Well, maybe there's a voice in there somewhere. If I keep listening for it, maybe I'll hear it. And so it's another mode of failure that's failing in a way differently from the way Morse failed, but it's another thing that where the message is not quite getting through, things aren't quite happening, it's all a little broken. And going back to the sort of composer aspect of my work again, these decisions were partly made on the theoretical ideas I've just been discussing, but they're also musical ideas. The Morse code sections give me a set of rhythmic structures to work with and kind of an opportunity for the sounders to sort of solo and act more as individual agents. The voice synthesis algorithms I'm using, which basically involve using larger masses of the sounders, you kind of hear that, you could hear in the video, you sort of have some slow bits where there's one thing going, and then you have these sort of larger waves. That was also giving me the opportunity to play with these sort of more massed, mobile sort of chorals, and also create musical gestures on a different kind of time scale. Because of course, the Morse, the time scale you're looking at is really the letter. Whereas since I'm directly using spoken words with the Fox material, then we're at the time scale of the word, the phrase, the sentence. So these are also serving a formal function. So there's always this dynamic between the sort of theoretical function, the formal function, and the actual materials. So juxtaposing these two different modes of expression, which are, as I say, are both kinds of failures in their own ways, I also think of this piece as sort of a meditation on language and communication in general. So when we're kind of negotiating the gap between when I'm trying to say something right now, like I'm trying to say something to you, well, I got my little ideas and I got my words and I got my ideas and I think they work, but at some point it goes outside of me into the medium, and I really don't know what's happening at the other end. And so what we have with language and communication is a construction that's always a little rickety and is always potentially breaking down. And we never know if our message is getting across. And we're never even sure we're getting a message if there's actually someone else on the other end sending it. So this piece is a kind of attempt to solidify those ideas about communication, about history, and about the object, all in kind of a single dynamic package. The end. Now I gotta switch to Zoom so I can see what's going on. Stop looking at my notes.
Well,
Okay.
Thank you, Matthew. That was great. So now we have entered into the question and answer portion of today's program. So if anybody has a question for Matthew, I think we can either at this point, if you feel more comfortable, if you want to type it in the chat box, I can read it to Matthew, or if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and asking it directly to Matthew, please feel free to do so.
Can you hear me? This is David Quinn. Can I make a question?
Yep.
Oh, good. Thank you. It seems to me, and Matthew, if you would comment on this, that the audience, that the interpretation, or that the listener, however, the communicee, plays a significant role in the entirety of this object, of this piece. In other words, there's a great deal of communication through you from Fox and Morse and all of the insights that you have into it. But ultimately, the audience sits there in that room and interprets it to complete, if you will, the cycle of this communication. Am I correct in that, Matthew?
Well, I mean, kind of, but of course, you know, a lot of the scaffolding, the sort of, you know, intellectual scaffolding that I've just, you know, dragged you through is not necessarily something that anyone walking into there is going to know about, you know. You know, there's 300 words on the card, might give you some vague idea, but, you know, ultimately all of these things are open-ended, and people do with them whatever they will do. And I can't really control that, nor do I want to. And I think a lot of what I'm really aiming for, because you are right about one thing, is audience experience is extremely important to me, because ultimately this is kind of show business, you know. And what I'm interested really in is, in this environment, I think the feeling of the energy that I'm trying to get across between the behaviors and the objects and the psychological resonances don't even necessarily have to be something that an audience member would articulate to themselves verbally, but rather sort of an energetic mode that what they're feeling is the energy going on. So, I mean, in a way, of course, the audience always closes the circuit. Otherwise, it's just something sitting in your drawer. Well, that doesn't fit in my drawer, but it's just something sitting somewhere. So, of course, it's, you know, work is never complete if there's no one, you know, tree falls in the forest and all that. So, I don't know if that answered your question, but it was an attempt.
We have a question in the chat box. Would you encourage visitors to listen with their eyes closed?
Well, it would be hard to read the text cards. But I would say some of both. I mean, it's funny, because I was thinking, what do I do when I go in and listen to it? And it's like, well, sometimes my eyes are open, because the fact is the objects are all pretty cool, and seeing it is definitely interesting. But of course, closing your eyes also, yeah, you of course you concentrate more on the sound if you blocked out the visual information, because if our eyes are open, about 90% of our brain tends to go to encoding visual information, and 10% of it goes to encoding sound. So if you close your eyes, then more of your brain is going to be encoding the sound information. So some of both.
I have a question for Matthew. I'm kind of curious, because you tell us where you found all of those Morse code the keys or the sounders?
No, they're sounders. Keys are for input. Sounders are for output.
So the sounders, all of the sounders.
Where does anyone find any of that kind of stuff? eBay. Of course, it's all from 100% eBay. I guarantee you can go on eBay right now. There are half a dozen. Yeah, I actually, because I had to buy so many of them, I actually had to spread out my buying over about 6 months, because I was absolutely sure if I just started buying them all up, I would double the price. You know, I figured I could probably all myself do a pump and dump on the Telegraph Sounder market. So yeah, so I get like, you know, couple month, and you know, so.
So how much did you pay for those sounders?
Very widely. The cheapest one, probably about $25. The most expensive one, probably close to 80. because you would also go through these, the market had its own little mini fluctuations. Certain requirements, they had to actually be operable, which actually it's interesting, you know, a piece of technology like this. I would get something that had obviously been like sitting in a barn since like 1950 or probably 1930. Clean it off, plug it in, works. You know, your phone should do so well, right? So.
I think besides sitting and listening, looking at all of the sounders, they're all different, and they're all sort of works of art in their own respect, on their own account.
Oh yeah, they're all super cool. Yeah.
We have another question in the chat box, which was actually similar to one that I was going to ask too. So the question in the chat box is, how does this exhibition compare to your other exhibitions? I was going to ask you, how many other places have you also installed this particular exhibition, and does it change at all based on the space that you're installing it in?
Well, let's see. I've shown
that was a lot of questions.
This piece is done pretty well. It's been in a couple, 3 places in New York. It's been in Newburgh, it's been in Livingston Manor, and now Albany. And I've also shown it. It was shortlisted for the New Technological Art Award in Ghent, Belgium, where I showed it last year, and also at a sound art gallery in Berlin. So this piece has been around a little bit. It depends on the layout of the space. Some spaces I've done it as simply one long bench. Other places I do the 2 across. Other than that, because of the way, I mean, I really didn't even scratch the surface of all the compositional decisions that I've made in this piece, because of course another compositional decision is the spatialization of the sounds. How are the sounds moving around in their thing? So I kind of can't lay them out any which way, because they're deliberate trajectories of movement if you're sort of, as you kind of hawk it from one sounder to another. So it tends to be either 2 benches or 1 super long bench. So it's been around. I mean, in terms of my other pieces, the robotic pieces I've done, I tend to like working with this idea of a choir of identical objects. Partly because, you know, if you've got a bunch of multiples, it's already modern art. And also because and because of the sort of composer interest I have in like working with a small possibility of sound sets. The last piece I did in this vein was for, I think I mentioned it, 15 dial telephones. Also all computer controlled, where I had manual control over how the hammer rolls. But that was much less. They tended to be more scattered in a disorganized way around. Again, a whole set of ideas about. Those I've worked with fluorescent lights, arrays of fluorescent lights, which I've amplified. So, you know, things like that, but tending to work in the idea of multiples and having their, you know, if I have a whole sort of, you know, congeries of different objects, well, then it's much harder to try to focus the kinds of ideas I'm trying to apply. If I've got one thing or many copies of one thing, then I can kind of concentrate my thinking on what's the one thing doing. So if I got a bunch of different things, then yeah. Did that answer at least half of your questions?
I think so. Lex asked, where did you show it in Berlin?
Okay. A gallery called Errant Sound, ERRANT. It's in Mitte.
Do we have any other questions for Matthew tonight? Looks like that might be the last question that came through. So
All right.
Matthew, thank you so much for your presentation. It was great. I hope
Thank you.
everybody, if you haven't had a chance to come to the Albany Institute to see the installation, please do so.
Definitely more fun in IMAX.
And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.
And thank you all again for having me.